I find that writing a strong or exceptional essay is less about identifying a killer or unique topic that features high-flying metaphors and flares for the dramatic. Instead, the best essays often come from minimizing suboptimal stylistic tendencies and avoiding common missteps. I consider filming two separate videos, one with tips about writing strong essays and another about mistakes to avoid, but I've combined them together into one longer video since these pieces of advice are two sides of the same best practices essay writing coin. It's difficult to discuss what to avoid without sharing potential best practices. Some of this content shares advice from my third book, College Essay Best Practices and Editing Style Guide, which is available only to my clients. My initial tips address big picture content questions about how to choose a topic and what to write. The latter half of this video covers specific stylistic missteps that students frequently make. Providing advice specific to your experience isn't easy to generalize, and that's the sort of brainstorming and idea formulation work that my clients and I do with my premium essay feedback and consulting services. First, understand the goal of the college essays. Your Common App main essay, plus university or UT-specific supplements, attempts to persuade reviewers that you deserve a space in your desired program relative to the competition. Effective college applications communicate a handful of interesting experiences specific to you. That can include anything from major-specific competencies, academic experiences, leadership roles, volunteer commitments, advocacy, work and internships, research endeavors, family obligations, or personal projects that might involve robotics, band, sports, academic competitions, cultural activities, and so on. What matters to universities is that you articulate your interests and identities that are intrinsic and specific to you, with reference to particular examples and memories that support your candidacy. There's no such thing as selecting topics or content that admissions reviewers want to hear. It's a common FAQ that I receive. Thousands of admissions books and blog posts overly complicate college essay roles and goals. They flood the information space with misconceptions, stress, and suboptimal advice. Undoubtedly nowadays, ChatGPT-generated and low-effort content will continue complicating finding high-quality college essay advice. I also believe that reading too many blogs and books will offer conflicting perspectives that are difficult to reconcile, partly because the authors themselves don't actually reflect on this fundamental question of what is the college essay's function and goal. I discuss in a subsequent video how you probably shouldn't even read college essay examples, including the ones I feature on my text admissions blog. Second, college essays provide an invitation to write. Since your application goal is to share and develop a handful of interesting aspects of your commitments, identities, and interests, you should shape your content based on what you want to share rather than fitting yourself into constraining questions. Applicants often reverse the sequence by looking at an essay question and then attempting to pigeonhole themselves into what they think the universities want to hear. Still, it requires some mental gymnastics to approach your essays by thinking, what do I want to share? Then you can write out your experiences and stories before inserting them into a question, rather than examining a question like, how do your perspectives contribute to our campus? That means it doesn't matter which of the Common App choose one of 7 questions that you shall select. You should approach college essays as identifying the perspectives and dimensions of your experiences that you wish to share, rather than getting bogged down on the questions themselves. The takeaway is to never interpret questions too literally or narrowly. They're merely invitations to write. Identify what matters to you and worry later about how to pair it with a specific prompt. Next, the Common App main essay doesn't need to do everything. Students and families make the common, if unconscious, error of believing that the Common App main essay needs to do everything. They attempt to cram leadership, volunteering, major-specific experiences, humorous anecdotes, and diversity into a 650-word submission. But the main essay only needs to illustrate 1, 2, or maybe 3 interesting things about you. Nothing more. Students and clients of mine have written outstanding essays on their love for ice cream, caring for plants, how astronomy connects to band, and any number of topics or even thematic combinations. Writing 1 or 2 themes more deeply rather than superficially overviewing many experiences is also always preferable. Fourth, where content is distributed among the essays is less important than whether to include it at all. Students almost always stress about where a content chunk goes rather than whether to include it at all. For example, they might want to discuss being National Honor Society president, but instead of writing out their experiences, they hesitate and they don't write anything. Then, without having written anything, they wonder whether an idea should go in a main essay or a supplement. Instead, I recommend that you write out the content first and later on figure out where it distributes within the essay questions. I call this approach a pre-question draft, where your essays are written about the things that matter to you, and this could include anything like rocketry competitions, robotics, band, chess club, DECA, HOSA, and so on. You can share stories, experiences, examples, and details of how you've deepened your commitments over time. So don't let questions around where will this thing go prevent you from getting started. It's very rare to submit a Common App main essay topic on the very first thing that comes to mind. Consequently, that means it's really important to, fifth, experiment with initial drafts. Writing out first drafts only costs time and energy. You're also not constrained to writing a perfect 650-word essay on the first try. For my clients, I always recommend that they write around twice or maybe 3 times as many words as the eventual essay submission limit. So that means if they're aiming for a 650-word Common App main essay submission, I say try for 1,200 or 1,500 words. I invite my clients to experiment with quirky, idiosyncratic, or unconventional themes and styles. For example, some analytically minded computer science or engineering applicants discover that they have a flair for metaphors or storytelling. My humanities and social science students occasionally attempt to write more rationally and logically. Since you're not writing for a grade, you have the opportunity to at least try something different or outside of your comfort zone. A writing style that works for one student or an older sibling, or an essay example that you read online, may not fit your temperament, but you can only develop your writing voice by trying something new. It's no big deal if you try something that doesn't work. The worst case scenario is that you write something that doesn't make it into a final submission. Also, try not to get overly attached to first drafts, but as you work through the rewriting and editing phases, you should also avoid throwing out complete and proofread essays. At some point, you need to settle on both what you're writing about and how you write, because some students will stall out and spend weeks and even months on a single essay. So try not to get bogged down on something. And if you're receiving feedback and that feedback is, hey, this is working, then maybe accept that feedback so that way you can submit your application and move on to other things that matter to you or other college applications. Next, choose a Common App main essay topic that would benefit from storytelling and that might also require more space to develop than a shorter supplement. Earlier, I recommended that you pre-draft a handful of themes, experiences, or commitments and then figure out where to place them. Since supplements almost always require a stick-to-the-facts approach, you can choose the theme for your Common App main essay that would benefit from a deeper dive story or a set of stories that develops how you've pursued your interests. Some Common App essays develop a single theme or activity with varied examples or angles to that commitment. Others might create what I call a hybrid approach that connects 2 or maybe 3 seemingly unrelated themes and connects them together. For example, one of my clients a few years back wrote 2 separate shorter essay first drafts about math competitions and then their relatively obscure hobby, cardistry, which is elaborate and artistic shuffling techniques. We pieced the 2 themes together in clever ways by connecting them with the discussion around probability, geometry, and permutations, and that student ended up gaining their admission to a top 10 CS program for early decision, so it worked out. 7. Never write lingering introductions or let me sum up everything I've just told you conclusions. It's essential to avoid these types of conclusions or these here's everything I'm going to tell you overview type of introduction. Most applicants start their main essay or supplements with some sort of overview about like the importance of service or a definition of friendship rather than simply talking about a specific volunteering experience or a particular memory with their best friend. Always begin with a moment of action that helps establish the setting of your experiences and that also provides an action sequence. That requires establishing who, what, when, and where. For example, an applicant writing about robotics could share the context and setting in their opening sentence. Their first sentence could read, quote, "The buzzer rang in the final round of the FRC Robotics State Championship my junior year in San Antonio." The second sequence can then establish an action sequence that addresses how within the context of their experience. The second sentence could read, "I hurried to our driver Aditi while our teammates strategized how to secure more points with our alliance in the endgame period." Providing a clear setting and action sequence signals to your reviewer what to expect, in this case, an essay about robotics in a particular competition. Since admissions reviewers read 20 to 30 applications each day, you don't want to risk losing them with an ambiguous introduction. What makes sense in your head might not to an anonymous admissions reviewer who doesn't have access to your memories and experiences. You must always write clearly about what's going on. Try not to be too clever or try hard. Introductions also provide an opportunity to introduce a rhetorical device like a simile, metaphor, or symbol. Moreover, introductions don't require you to start from the beginning chronologically. Often, I find a compelling anecdote in the middle of a student's first draft, and then we move it up to the beginning of their main essay. Then, after establishing the setting and sharing an anecdote with an action sequence, we use the second paragraph to provide the background or more distant experiences that detail why they've pursued their activities in question. In the case of the robotics essay, a second paragraph could begin, quote, "My 7th grade technology elective introduced me to robotics when my classmates and me programmed Legos Mindstorms." Another technique that my clients sometimes use is I encourage them to write whatever comes to mind without trying to force an introduction. Then I read their first draft and I find the single best sentence and start the essay there. Leading with your best sentence is like a baseball team placing their highest batting average hitter at the top of the lineup. After all, you only have one chance to make a fleeting first impression on your reviewers, so don't drop the ball. Finally, conclusions are the least important part of any college essay, or perhaps any writing in general. It's okay and almost always preferable for essays to simply end. Parents in particular love to insert these "let me sum up what I've told you" conclusions into their child's essays, so please resist this temptation. Consider how often you even read a news article or a blog until the very end. It's almost never. Every sentence must provide either new information or tie together a rhetorical device featured in the introduction. Next, don't move too fast. Consider the following sentences. Quote, "While I was volunteering at the animal shelter, I also completed a summer leadership program and earned an A in AP macroeconomics over the summer. I earned a captain position on my soccer team and also led us to a regional UIL qualification." In this example, the writer underdevelops a few experiences that require additional elaboration. Each experience, like the animal shelter, leadership program, summer school, and being a soccer captain, provides an opportunity to supply additional context. They moved too fast onto completely unrelated experiences that lack substance, creating a vague and impersonal submission. College essays are an opportunity to articulate how and why you pursue your commitments and interests rather than simply a record or a description or a list of what you have done. Slow down and develop a few examples more fully rather than hurrying through many of them. Next, illustrate and don't tell. Share concrete examples and avoid vagueness. College essays must make every sentence count. The 3 most important and overlapping college essay rules of thumb are to illustrate your experiences, avoid vagueness, and write economically. Conventional writing advice counsels to show and don't tell, but I prefer the term illustrate rather than show because it encourages you to supply details and establish the setting by answering questions like who, what, when, where, and why, and also how, in the introduction and also throughout your essay. Illustrating an anecdote helps contextualize how and why the applicant pursues their activities, which also complements the resume. Illustrating particular examples remedies concerns around vagueness or abstraction. Illustrate, don't tell requires supplying anecdotes that provide a visual in your reader's mind. Illustrations require a significant allocation of words while sharing concrete examples and identifying specifics, which applies to almost any sentence in any essay. As an editor advising students, I constantly ask myself and also them, are there any additional details the writer can supply? Most of the suggestions that I offer on a first or a second draft boil down to simple suggestions like tell me more, or be more specific, or can you provide an example that develops your point or experience? Clarifying dozens of minor abstractions will accumulate into a thoughtful and personal essay that's unique to you. There are always opportunities to provide specifics at a sentence or even a phrase level. For example, you can convert an impersonal sentence like, "I look forward to my grandma's holiday cooking," to something more specific and personal to you, like, My grandma's spicy pork tamales, smothered in red habanero salsa, vanishes every Christmas. That creates a visualization in your reader's mind. You can also consider providing a name or a pseudonym whenever you mention a friend, a classmate, or a teacher. Rather than speaking generally by writing something like, I would hustle every soccer match sophomore year, you can provide a specific match that illustrates where you hustled the most. Like, for example, during our homecoming game sophomore year against our rival Memorial, I defended their Division I senior recruit, Michelle. She pushed me harder than any opposing striker since. Note that even in this small phrase, we've identified who, what, when, where, and how. A similar piece of advice is to 10. Always illustrate food and culture. I'm a big fan of food and culture essays because they provide ample opportunities to describe feelings, sensations, tastes, smells, relationships, influences, and memorable experiences. Family holidays and traditions allow opportunities to build a setting, especially in that introduction. They also invite opportunities for rhetorical devices like symbols and metaphors. Sufficiently developing an anecdote about your grandma's favorite Thanksgiving dishes can help generalize about connections to your family or its traditions. Almost every other theme or topic can rely on some degree or telling of a stick-to-the-facts approach, but telling without showing or illustrating your food preferences and cultural connections always makes for a mediocre and impersonal essay. That means food and culture essays are always deeply personal and specific to the applicant, so that sidesteps concerns about being overly generic. More so than any other theme, I encourage students to dig deep into their memories to detail their food and cultural experiences. Writing about food also provides strong visuals to your reader. It's easy for them to relate to and imagine sharing your experiences. Also, low-key, triggering hunger in your reader is a subtle way for your essay to stand out. There's opportunities to use descriptive adjectives like savory, mouthwatering, delectable, fragrant, zesty, succulent, and aromatic. Many precise cooking verbs include sizzle, simmer, steam, whip, marinate, garnish, infuse, caramelize, braise, and poach. Food also provides a perfect vehicle to build an essay around work experience, a cultural extracurricular, or adapting to different environments. Moreover, essays based on culture and religion provide opportunities to illustrate themes from holidays, services, or talents like Indian classical dance or Brazilian capoeira. I also like to expand the definition of food and culture to include reading, music, and sometimes television. These themes require you to illustrate specific influences, favorite authors, memorable episodes, or how your literary or cultural interests influence you. Next, minimize lessons learned. Your essays should almost always favor illustrating specific examples over abstract or generalized lessons learned. Sufficiently developed examples will imply these character traits like resilience or perseverance or internal motivation. Asserting lessons learned without supporting them with anecdotes or specific experiences will produce impersonal, vague, and nonspecific essays. Sometimes students outline their essays around themes like patience or the value of family and self-discipline. And then they provide a paragraph that occasionally illustrates their point, but then it usually drifts into generalizations or assertions that aren't backed up with examples. That means it's almost always better to write about a specific experience or develop a particular memory and then worry about themes or personality traits later on, rather than trying to pick a virtue and then trying to build an essay around an abstract value. Funny enough, when you try to construct college essays on ChatGPT, it always inserts these kinds of unhelpful lessons learned content, presumably because it's trained on data of, many tens of thousands of mediocre college essays online. You should also avoid writing a "here are the lessons this experience taught me" sort of conclusion. Since almost every applicant writes these conclusions, one easy way to stand out is just don't do the same. 12. Clarify generalizations and humanize others-centered content. A typical error in service and volunteering essays is that the applicant writes about helping or serving others, who are usually less fortunate, without adequately humanizing who they are serving. Applicants will often generalize about the other side of the town, or some unnamed third world or developing country. The charity recipient usually functions as an object in the story rather than an active participant. Incorporating the plural we and our rather than the singular I or my helps produce a more collaborative tone. Providing biographical details about, for example, a student you tutor named Eric, whose favorite team is the Lakers and maybe struggles with adding polynomials, humanizes Eric rather than serves as a generic placeholder to discuss a service experience. Similarly, I often receive first drafts that incorporate cliched sentiments like, "As my work began, I hoped to make their day, but little did I know that they would make my day." This cliche still often objectifies service recipients by attempting to overemphasize how the volunteers learn more than the students that they tutored. While these sentiments about learning from others are preferable to passive volunteer recipients, they almost always lack nuance and specificity. When students write first drafts about how their young learners made their day, I encourage them to share specific examples that illustrate that assertion. After all, there is no such thing as a cliched topic, only cliched implementation. And that brings me to my next point. Avoid hyperbole and cliché. Over-reliance on hyperbole became a peculiar issue in 2023. A few clients reported consuming TikTok influencers and other admission social media. Those content sources recommended applicants to really play up their experiences and add in flares for dramatic. Almost every client in that cycle attempted to incorporate hyperbole and melodrama, or they made mountains out of molehills. I couldn't have recalled a cycle where there were such pervasive instances of hyperbole. Those students frequently ask me how they can make their essays more emotional and passionate, and the answer is you just don't. A transfer client even shared how their former college counselor told them to make their essay more emotional without providing concrete feedback about incorporating that suggestion. The upside is that if many college applicants consume the same social media advice, the typical college essay submission will be of even lower quality than usual. You must always illustrate concrete experiences that support your assertions. College essays are not a fiery speech that you give to support your National Honor Society president candidacy or a politician who's pounding on the podium. Hyperboles are exaggerated statements not meant literally, and synonyms include embellishment, aggrandizement, and grandiosity. Since I serve many families in Texas, the most common cliches I encounter involve the Texas summer heat. Students write things like, "I felt like an egg boiling during August marching band practice," or "The relentless heat in Texas was like walking through an inferno with every step feeling like a journey across hot coals." Honestly, when you're setting a scene during a Texas summer, don't try to describe it. Texas summers are hot, like water is wet. Additionally, the most common UT Austin applicant cliche mentions something like, "I'm bleeding orange as a Longhorn," or "I will die before I earn my degree from anywhere but UT. I just remove every instance of trying too hard to articulate your desire to enroll at UT. In general, trying too hard or attempting to be more emotional and passionate will not impress your reviewers. Instead, you should rely on sufficiently illustrated memories and experiences that speak for themselves. Next, if you incorporate a rhetorical device, go all the way. Commonly used rhetorical devices include analogies, similes, metaphors, symbols, repetition, or otherwise descriptive language that help illustrate your experiences and interest. Rhetorical devices should always clarify your message to your reader rather than using complex or abstract language for its own sake. Practical usage of rhetorical devices may emphasize particular ideas that help persuade your reviewer that you're a competent leader, programmer, club officer, and so on. Compelling college essays don't require rhetorical devices, but almost all of the best submissions incorporate them. One role rhetorical devices play is helping tie the concluding thoughts with the opening sentences. But students' most common error is like half-baking a metaphor, usually in the opening sentences, but then it doesn't reappear at all in the body paragraphs. Forcing a rhetorical device when an essay doesn't require it, or using visual language unrelated to or contradictory with the content that you write, will detract from submission quality. Consider this ChatGPT-generated example of what you should avoid. My role as a volunteer coordinator was a lighthouse of guidance in the vast sea of service. Yet the storms of unpredictability threaten to erode the foundations of our collective effort. Analogy in rhetorical language doesn't work because there's nothing related nautically to being an NHS member or officer. And so it just doesn't quite make sense. That also means that students rarely deliberately incorporate a rhetorical device into their essays, or when they try, they improperly implement it. Usually, my clients and I stumble upon metaphors or symbols by accident. Then, after identifying a potential image, I encourage students to expand upon and fully develop or experiment with the potential rhetorical devices that they then weave as a thread throughout their essay. I almost always need to assist applicants with incorporating rhetorical devices that enhance clarity while abiding by word economy techniques. So honestly, it's pretty difficult to provide a generic advice about incorporating rhetorical techniques in a video like this. Number 15. College essay tone straddles formal and informal. College essays don't fit neatly on the formal-informal spectrum. Cover letters, dissertations, newspaper articles, grant proposals, technical manuals, policy reports, and graduate school statements of purpose or academic journals will require a formal tone with varying standards and rules. Those rules are guided by things like the Modern Language Handbook, MLA, the Chicago Manual of Style, or the Oxford Style Manual. And these things outline strict recommendations for formatting, grammar, and stylistic minutiae for publications. However, college essays don't need to adhere to a particular style guide like MLA or AP, partly because college applications don't cite sources. Frankly, many parents derail their child's college essays by trying to force standards from their own professional life or from one of these style guides into the college essay. Consequently, college essays only require consistency. So if you use contractions in one instance, and contractions are acceptable, deploy them throughout. Don't use do not in some instances and don't in others. College essays are more formal than blog posts or diary entries, but are not as formal as science reports or Wikipedia articles. Nevertheless, a college application might incorporate stylistic elements that are formal or informal. Overly formal college essays, they just feel awkward, and they should primarily reflect the tone of an adolescent emerging into adulthood who is prepared to move away from home. That means there is no universal college essay style guide. These final tips provide a few stylistic considerations to make your essay more word economical and information dense. 16. Rarely begin sentences with dependent clauses, dangling modifiers, adverbial clauses, or infinitive phrases. Consider the following sentence that begins with a dependent clause. The dependent clause is, curious to see what else I could create, comma, I bulldozed the skyscraper and developed a picturesque beach scene with a boat and a water slide. There's nothing grammatically wrong with beginning sentences with dependent clauses. However, they're often unnecessary and they invite run-on sentences. Dependent clauses tend to diminish rather than improve clarity. In the previous sentence example, we could remove the phrase, curious to see what I could create entirely, and the sentence would communicate the same concept about designing a beach scene. Writers often lean on dependent clauses, dangling modifiers, adverbial clauses, and infinitive phrases as a rhetorical crutch. I receive many first drafts where almost every single sentence begins with some phrase followed by a comma, whether it's optimal or not. Deploy dependent clauses sparingly and intentionally to save on words. It also varies up your sentence structures. I even asked ChatGPT if writers should generally avoid dangling modifiers, and it answered, quote, yes, writers should generally avoid dangling modifiers. A dangling modifier is a word or phrase intended to modify a noun, but it's placed in a position where it doesn't clearly or logically modify the intended word. This can lead to confusion or awkwardness in the sentence. Close quote. A similar rule of thumb is to almost never start sentences with words like whether, although, from, or while. Beginning sentences with these conjunctions and prepositions invite run-on sentences and underdeveloping your experiences or moving too fast. Some writers use these as rhetorical crutches, where almost every sentence in their first draft looks similar. It invites overly cumbersome and wordy syntax that doesn't help you write economically. Remember, the goal of the college essay is to always be as clear and precise as possible. 17. Split run-on sentences into 2 or 3. Remember, simple sentences are your friend. Sentences should rarely exceed 30 or 40 words, unless there's some explicit rhetorical or information packaging reasons for doing so. If you need more than one breath to read a sentence aloud, chances are it's a run-on. Starting sentences with the dependent clauses and phrases mentioned in the previous tip also invites run-on sentences. These sentences tend to move too fast, which is something that I discussed earlier. Avoid using complicated syntax for its own sake because you don't want to risk losing your tired and underpaid and overworked admissions reader. Next, almost always convert from passive to active voice. Passive voice occurs when the subject of a sentence receives the action of the verb rather than committing the action. But since you're writing a college essay from a first-person point of view that often has action sequences, you need to be the person committing the action rather than receiving the action, except in really narrow exceptions. That means all of your college essays should minimize passive voice. ChatGPT and I agree. It said, although the passive voice has its uses, it's important to use it judiciously and to consider the context and purpose of your writing. Overusing the passive voice can make writing sound indirect or unclear. Passive voice also produces impersonal essays that drift towards abstraction. After all, your college essays are about you, your actions, and your experiences. Let's consider a few simple examples of how we convert passive voice into their more active and word economical alternatives. The passive voice is James was tossed the ball by Patrick in 7 words. The active voice in 5 words is Patrick tossed James the ball. Next, I was surprised by the sudden departure of my math teacher. That's 11 words, and was surprised is the passive voice. The active voice changes the sentence structure around to say, my math teacher's sudden departure surprised me. Requires only 7 words. Next, minimize and substitute be-verbs. Over-reliance on the be-verbs am, is, are, was, were, being, and been diminishes your essay's facility with language and produces imprecise action sequences. You should substitute flat be-verbs with active, more descriptive verbs and phrases. Let's consider the following examples. The coffee on the table is hot can be substituted, or you can substitute, the coffee steams on the table. The garden is beautiful changes to the garden blooms. The city is busy changes to the city bustles. The child is being disobedient could read the child defies authority and rules. One sentence that's unclear or underdeveloped. The book was interesting. You could change. The book's intriguing storyline reminded me of my childhood. 20. Remove empty or superfluous modifiers. My 2 favorite books about the craft of writing are Strunk and White's Elements of Style and Stephen King's On Writing. They advise against superfluous modifiers. For example, a project is either finished or not. It cannot be completely finished. The adverb completely is redundant, but almost finished could be more appropriate if the writer provides more context because almost is an intermediate state between finished and not. A phrase like especially intrigued detracts from clarity and drifts toward hyperbole. Avoid redundant modifiers like absolutely certain or really excited. For an incredibly amazing experience, amazing implies it's also incredible. So, an amazing experience can stand alone. These usages might work in the spoken word for emphasis or during a political or corporate rally, but we should almost always eliminate them in the written word. Next, substitute passive verbs for active alternatives. Almost every inexperienced writer relies on a small set of the most frequently used verbs and adjectives, or they provide obscure words randomly without consideration for whether they should write a more common alternative. So we never want to use obscure language for its own sake. Consider alternatives if your passage contains multiple instances of the same verb, like build or cook. The idea is not to utilize fancy words for their own sake, but to identify precise alternatives that often implicitly bundle verbs and adjectives together with adverbs. For example, walk quickly could become rush or hurry. Accumulating precise adjectives and active verbs produces stronger visuals in your reader's mind. It also increases your facility with language while illustrating your experiences more clearly in your reader's mind. It also requires using fewer words. You can pause this video and check out examples on screen if you wish to see alternatives to common verbs like say, walk, run, do, use, and build make. 22. Don't decide to do something. Just do it. Writers overly rely on prefacing an action with decided to, as in, I decided to go to school. Instead, consider the word economical alternative. I went to school. You either commit an action or not. But in the written word, you cannot decide to do something, because the act itself implies a made decision, especially if it occurred in the past tense. And virtually any verb in a college essay could feature the phrase decided to, so let's just remove it. One niche situation where decided to could work is if you're in a situation where there's some desire that forces you to make an alternative decision. For example, I decided to study computer science, but I changed my mind before enrolling at my university and opted for information science instead. Still, I enrolled in computer science before changing my majors to informatics also works sufficiently and word economically well. Finally, avoid over-editing. Many of my clients, and high-achieving people in general, understandably tend to be perfectionists. They're overly meticulous. Over-editing tends to begin in the proofreading phase. However, over-editing symptoms sometimes appear early on in the process when students fail to stay on task, or they focus excessive time and attention on one essay at the expense of all the others. Stress and expectations at home or school can cause about a quarter of my clients to over-edit, and I can never tell in advance who may succumb to this siren song. Over-editing is a common phenomenon that occurs when students have completed their final drafts and they're ready to submit, yet they pause, second-guess, and descend into analysis paralysis. Days and sometimes weeks pass. And it's counterproductive because over-editing delays the application submission, it leads to more stress and anxiety, and it isn't a productive use of time. Over-editing symptoms include trying too hard to make a great essay better, yet ended up doing the opposite. Subsequent over-edited drafts are often or always of lesser quality than the previous ones. Continued edits on completed drafts result in less fluency and more clichés. Students substitute specific details with vague generalities to try and add more emotion and passion. Behaviors include scrutinizing every minutia for issues that may or may not exist and staying up to the wee hours of the morning working on their college essays. Over-involved parents sometimes dictate what they feel should be included, which may be contrary to the student's wishes or my professional opinion of what works and what doesn't. Even the most talented and high-achieving students often don't know what content is or isn't critical or effective. They remove and add content without much regard for quality or necessity. They're a little bit like an inexperienced chess player who moves pieces willy-nilly during the middle of a game. ChatGPT also can't help weigh the relative merits of particular content or alternatives. One downside of the advice, always try your best, is that it's hard to know when your essays are good enough and ready to submit. I help my clients assess when their essays are as good as they're going to get and also ready to submit. I hope you enjoyed this video about the best practices and what to avoid when writing your Common App main essay. If you want assistance on your college applications, reach out to me directly at kevin@techsubmissions.com and complete the questionnaire in the information section of this video for a free email admissions consultation. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.